publication of Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla in 1872, the stories of female vampires featured queer women. For some, the story or film's nature was subtext, and for others it was full-blown text. Even amidst the Hays Code, the sapphic nature of the female vampire did not go untouched. Released in 1936, Dracula's Daughter brings us a vampire that wishes to end her thirst for blood. Attempting to receive help for her disease, the Countess struggles to let go of a thirst that is as natural to her as ours is to water. Hello, and thank you for joining me today on the Quiet Riot. If you are new here, this is where we talk film, television, and media. I'm Ainsley, and today we are discussing Dracula's Daughter, the sequel to Universal's Dracula, released in 1931 and starring Bela Lugosi. I had actually heard of Dracula's Daughter previously, but I didn't really know what film it was because it is often discussed when it comes to discussing queer culture within Hollywood or within the film industry as a whole. And so I have definitely heard about this, but really recognizing it and knowing it as a sequel to Dracula and exactly what the film was, my recent viewing was really the first time that I got to know this film. I did read some different thoughts that people had when it came to the overall subtext and sexuality that is featured in this film. Many different people have different views on that. Obviously, when you are looking at any film, really, you are seeing what you as a viewer may see based on your own experiences or the things that you've seen around you and based in the time that you view it. And then you also may see the subtext that is intentional based on the work of either the writer, the director, the original material in which it's based on, the IP, and even so the actor's performance. And when it comes to Dracula's Daughter, there is quite a bit of subtext and ways in which this film can be turned into an allegory for what it is to be gay and specifically what it is to be a queer woman. In many ways, I see this film as an allegory for what it is to be sapphic, whether that be a lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, or really to have any sexuality that is not heteronormative. And I don't expect that to be something that everybody agrees with who's seen this film, whether or not they themselves are queer or not. This is just my experience viewing this film and how I view this film and how definitely other people have viewed it since the film's initial release in 1936. I also see myself having some controversial opinions for this movie, and I don't know if someone who's going to watch this who hasn't seen it before, or if it's going to be someone who really loves this movie and seen it, or has seen it but doesn't really like it. So I'm not 100% sure how controversial some of my thoughts or opinions are going to be. So let's get started and discuss the Sapphic subtext in Dracula's Daughter. Adapted as a sequel to Universal's Dracula, Dracula's Daughter features Edward Van Sloan as the only returning cast member. While the film was said to be adapted from a deleted chapter from Bram Stoker's Dracula, Dracula's Guest, however, the film does not resemble the chapter in any way. It has been stated that the film was inspired by Carmilla. Universal did not originally have the rights to Dracula's Guest, and it was actually MGM who had originally had those rights. They had got them from Stoker's widow, and when they didn't end up making a film based on it, they ended up selling them to Universal, and Universal ended up making Dracula's Daughter. Now, this film does take place right after the death of Dracula, and what's weird to me is that Van Helsing is Von Helsing in this movie, but I will be referring to him as Van Helsing anytime he is mentioned in this video. It was reported that Holden was not pleased with the role, fearing that she would be typecasted in the same way that Bela Lugosi was typecasted after his portrayal of Dracula. Unfortunately, at the time, Bela Lugosi was having a really hard time, and throughout his career that continued as people saw him as a Dracula or a Dracula-type character. He was constantly being given roles within the horror genre, and I mean, I would love to work in the horror genre constantly, but it's also really difficult anytime someone expects something of you when you really want to spread your wings a lot. And that can be seen in, for different screenwriters and directors as well. Mark Clark believes that Holden's disgust for the role may have led to the quality of her performance. Her disdain for the part translates into a kind of self-loathing that perfectly suits her troubled character. Vampire and daughter to Count Dracula, Countess Mara Zaleska believes that she will be free from her curse if she destroys the body of her dead father. Mara turns to Dr. Jeffrey Garth. She kidnaps the doctor's assistant, Janet, and takes her to Transylvania, where a battle with the doctor and Countess ensues. Dracula's daughter is often mentioned. After all, the subtext isn't exactly subtle. Though it might seem pretty limited for a modern audience, there are several moments that could be perceived as a queer story. The Countess wishes to change her true nature and turns to a doctor to help her when all else fails. While this may not have been the intention, this detail does resemble a queer person turning to a doctor to cure them of their homosexuality. While Dracula appeared to embrace his true nature, Mara doesn't seem to love herself the way the Count did. Unfortunately, this film does have aspects of the predatory lesbian or predatory sapphic character role, a trope that is common in films, especially of this time, and can often be seen in a lot of horror and suspense and thriller films. And that can be very difficult to avoid, but being that this was made in the time that it was, and unfortunately that being such a very common stereotype, that's the way that people, particularly a modern audience, may view the character and the subject matter. However, her predatory nature that's caused by her vampirism is something she attempts to stop. In spite of some of the hangups that I do have with this movie, the characterization of Zaleska is not one of them. This is in part due to Holden's performance, and I really love what she brings to the character. She has this very gothic look to her, and she's very mesmerizing in the way that she uses her eyes. She's got these big dark eyes, and she's absolutely stunning in a very similar way that you'll find a lot of the male characters when they have a bit of like this raw magnetism, and it's almost like this mix of femininity and masculinity, which I personally think works very well with a vampire, and Holden does that perfectly. The character has power like her male counterpart, but she maintains empathy, something that Dracula seemed to lack. She also sees her vampirism as a prison, unlike Dracula in 31's film, who seemed to embrace and revel in his vampirism. The juxtaposition between the two characters can be seen as a person who accepts who they are completely, in spite of the struggles that may come with it. The other does not accept themselves and wishes to change to fit in. No matter how you look at Zaleska, she is a well-crafted villain who just so happens to be a woman who's in need of change. She's very sympathetic, and that's one of the things that makes her character so appealing. Dracula's Daughter was well received upon the film's release, but was not as financially successful as its predecessor. And it's also not as talked about as Dracula. It really was a first in some ways. It was the first vampire film for Universal, and it brought Dracula to the screen in sound. So it was like, and it was one of the first sound films for Universal. They were still getting into the swing of things. And the film is often talked about for many different reasons, where Dracula's Daughter doesn't get the same hype that Dracula did. And I can understand that in a lot of ways, but I'm gonna say something that may shock you. I personally prefer Dracula's Daughter to Dracula, and I do think a big part of that is most likely due to the fact that Dracula's daughter is something that I can personally connect to a lot better, and there's aspects of Zaleska that is quite appealing as a woman, and the way that she walks through the world. Being a vampire, she does have this power, and she does have power over others, but she also has certain weaknesses that come from her desires and the things that she can't control, and it's almost as if she's existing in this world that is not built to sustain her in the same way that it was to sustain her father Dracula, if that makes sense. And I can view this film in a very different way than I could view Dracula. Now, I really do love Dracula, particularly Bela Lugosi's performance, and I have talked about that film. It was actually not the last one, but the second film in my Dracula adaptations, sequels, and spin-offs series, which this is episode 4 of. And I'm excited to really dive more into the history of vampires within the film industry. I won't just be talking about American films, as I did in the first one actually discuss a Hammer horror film, Dracula. And if there's any ones that you think that you want to see on the channel that you would be interested in my thoughts on them, please let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. There is a New York Times review that referred to Gloria Holden as a remarkably convincing Batwoman. They also stated that the film was quite terrifying and referred to it as a cute little horror picture. Now, a lot of these thoughts at the time were based on 1930s horror and what people, especially based on these reviews, had seen in the US. And so from a modern point of view, this film is not really going to be scary at all. For the most part, watching this, it's more like watching the characters and how Zaleska and the others around her react to their surroundings and the situations that they're in. And that's what personally I find interesting about a lot of these horror films in the 1930s, because being someone who's watched horror films and horror adjacent films since I was a wee one, I do not get scared quite easily, and I don't think that a lot of people, even people who don't watch a lot of horror, are gonna watch this film and be scared. But there is a style and this very gothic nature to this film that makes it quite enjoyable. More recent reviews echo the sentiment that Gloria Holden gave a wonderful performance. Some point out, however, that the film is overacted in parts and tries too hard to be funny. A common sentiment is that the film lacks fright, is slow, and boring. And I definitely get that, because when we watch some of these films, they are so different from what we're used to when it comes to the pacing and what they found scary. And horror, particularly horror on screen, was still very new to people, so they would do different things. And I would not go into this film expecting something totally scary, and I'd expect that most people going into a film for the 1930s would definitely go in with that same thought, but I would just say this is more a stylistic, like a gothic film that just has this very gothic horror atmosphere to it. I mean, it is really nice to have people discuss Gloria Holden's performance in a very positive way. She does so well in this kind of role, and she does very well at this kind of like pale gothic woman who's mesmerizing and can really just grab the audience. When it comes to the overacting, I can definitely see that as well. I do find that a lot of the supporting characters were much better in the original Dracula, and some of them here, it's a little too much, but I do really like the one girl in it, because I really felt that she was terrified and she had this incredible innocence about her. I really believed that she was somebody who was very vulnerable and in need of some help, and she was willing to do anything to get that. And so this is how she got into that situation. And in many ways too, I feel like the character didn't get herself into the situation, obviously, but there was this allusion to consent for this character. And of course, that comes very much from my modern point of view, I'll say it again. But I did really like how there's this illusion of consent and this want to take it back. So that is a lot where this kind of predatory sense comes from. And after all, this is a vampire, she's thirsting for blood. But that whole scene really is something that I really enjoyed in that aspect of the storyline because it stood out to me the most. I do find that Dracula's daughter has better beats that allows the film to move swiftly from start to finish. I do think that the original Dracula was a bit slow in parts, and for me personally, Dracula's daughter had a much better flow to it. And I would say that a big part of that could be that being that the sound is a lot better, that adds something a little, that makes it a little more digestible for me personally. What works for Dracula's daughter over Dracula is in part the time in which it was made. When Dracula was released, sound was still new and Universal Studios were still learning. By the time Dracula's daughter was released in '36, the quality of sound was far better. And I don't want to put the quality of sound up against Dracula, especially when we're discussing them. So I don't want that to have to be like something that I truly look at and be like, this is why I like Dracula's daughter better. So I really, when it comes to Dracula's daughter, I have to say that the character of Zaleska is a character that I find a lot easier to connect with as a human. And that if you're looking for something that's quite foreign, then the character of Dracula is more for you. But if you're looking for a monster character, then Dracula's daughter, Zaleska, is much better for you. Dracula's daughter didn't have the same impact as its predecessor, but it has still managed to become a part of queer culture, if nothing else. Like many other vampire films, Dracula's daughter leans into the sexuality of the vampire. If anything, I would say the sapphic nature of the Countess really brings out the queer subtext often pointed to in vampire films. The Countess wishes to become a human again. She sees her vampirism as a curse and a disease. At this time, homosexuality was considered a mental illness. The general public believed that not being straight was a sin, and it was against the law to engage in same-sex relationships. While the vampire can certainly be used as an allegory for many things, in Dracula's daughter, it works best as an allegory for anything beyond the heteronormative spectrum. I know that when it comes to any film, regardless of whether or not it's a horror film, there are going to be people who just watch these films for the fun of it, for the entertainment value, and then there's going to be people like me who really love to look into the possible subtext of it and what it could mean, whether it's intentional or not. And for me, Dracula's daughter really represents what it is to be a queer woman and what it is to just experience something outside of what is considered normal. And in this time, obviously, as I had stated, these things were illegal and a lot of really bad things could happen to somebody regardless of whether or not they are what their sexuality is and a lot of the things they are forced into doing. And when it comes to certain aspects of this movie, we do see that Zaleska is coming to the conclusion that she's going to essentially not be her true nature. And even with her specific decisions that she makes when it comes to the end and what she ends up wanting from the doctor, a big part of that to me is this, you can see that very much as a beard or as a lavender marriage, which was a term back then to discuss typically two people who are both gay, both who are of the opposite sex but who are both gay, marrying each other. And I think that in her mind, if she enters this marriage, then at least she's putting on some type of front. And in many ways, that's also me just kind of spitballing some ideas of what the ending meant and what Zaleska wanted, and the decision that she made at the end, but for me, that's one of the things that makes film fun. I tend to watch a lot of movies for the hell of it, just to have fun. They're silly, and some films I, watch to enjoy them. They're not necessarily silly, but they're more for the entertainment value. And then there are ones that I love to look a lot deeper into, and Dracula's Daughter is definitely one of them. And again, films featuring vampires or really any type of mythological creature, anything within folklore, it's really interesting to delve into them and see how they are used as allegories. And when it comes to human sexuality, puberty, anything like that, oftentimes vampires, werewolves, and these other mythological creatures are used to represent that. And it was interesting to see how it was represented here in Dracula's Daughter. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to watch and or listen to this video. I really do appreciate it. This was episode 4 in Dracula's adaptation, sequels, and spin-offs. I do have a movie that I will be doing for the 5th episode, and I haven't quite decided which ones are going to be for 6 or 7, so if you have any ideas or things that you would like to see, please let me know in the comments. Let me know your thoughts on vampirism as an allegory. Which films that you think use vampirism as an allegory the best? Any recommendations? Sound off in the comments. I know that this is my opinions, these are my personal thoughts, and so not everyone's gonna really vibe with the fact that, oh, there's Sapphic subtext here, or that we're discussing queerness and in terms of vampires. But for me, I just think sexuality is such a big part of vampirism in film and in entertainment and literature and all of that. So that is something that I really like to veer into when I am watching a film. And it can be more than that. It can also just be general purity and all of that stuff. So whatever you got for me, let me know in the comments below. I am so glad that you decided to stick around. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, I really, really do appreciate you so much. And if you haven't already, like, subscribe, ring that bell to be notified every single time you post. Do like this if you enjoyed it, and I will link in the description box below my playlist so you can watch the other films in the series if you have not already. I will see you next time. Have a good day. Bye.